including CNN, MSNBC, USA Today, the New York Times, NBC, and the BBC, and has appeared on Hardball, The Daily Show, and C-SPAN's American History TV. He holds the titles Distinguished Professor of American History, Avron Fogelman Research Professor, and Director of Project Civitas at Lynn University, and Senior Fellow with Senator Bob Graham's Florida Joint Center for Citizenship. Two of Dr. Watson's recent works, Escape and George Washington's Final Battle, will be part of the focus of today's presentation. He's also the proud father of Alexander and Isabella. Please give a round of applause for Dr. Watson.
That was nice. Thank you for that kind introduction. Glad we have a record. I think the word got out that I was giving out black and white cookies today, which was not true. Those of you that know me know I don't give out cookies, I eat cookies, right? I'm a cookie monster. So thanks for coming, everybody. So this is my 31st year as a professor. Can you imagine? 31 years as a professor. And I don't believe I've gone more than a single semester in 31 years without multiple visits to my local libraries. So I'm a bibliophile, and I've always been a supporter of libraries, so I've always worked hard to go and offer book programs, talks, and I've done, I can't even count, I have to take my shoes off to count how many fundraisers I've done for area libraries, including the Palm Beach County system. So it's a delight to be back, and I've done a lot of programs here at Hagen Ranch. I also want to thank Hagen Ranch. My son, who's now a senior in college, he came up with a project when he was in middle school called Let's Write Together. What he did is he wrote several books for kids, and he had a writing contest, and the Palm Beach County Library System sponsored it for him. And we would get, he and I would get about 150 kids would submit short stories, and he would get teachers and librarians to judge them, and we published 35 of the best stories. I talked the publisher into comping us to service. We'd actually get a Library of Congress number, a professionally bound book, and 5th, 6th, 8th, 10th graders would get short stories published. We did it for 5 years, and we held it every year here at the Hagen Ranch Library. So it was really it was a wonderful opportunity. The teachers, the parents, the librarians would all come. And it was exciting to see the kids develop such confidence and a love of books and a love of writing, which is what my whole life has been about. And then I remember I talked to those kids afterward, and I'd say to them, the next time your school teacher gives you a 500-word assignment, you're going to go, 500 words, please, I'm a published author, right? And what was cute, my son and I, we would get extra copies of the book, and afterwards we'd go up to the kids and say, would you sign a copy for us? And the kids were like, what? And you can see them, and then I called a couple of reporters I know and had them come and do like mock interviews with the kids. It was a wonderful program. And Hagen Ranch gave us the space every year, so thanks to Hagen Ranch. So I wanted to do something a little different tonight. I'm looking around the audience and I know almost all of you. So that means all of you have suffered through countless lectures of mine for the last however many years. So what I thought I'd do today, instead of just talking about my new book or a new book, I thought I'd talk about why I like to write history books and share some stories with you, okay? So I'll start with when I was a senior in college, I went to Virginia Tech. We had a program where we had to meet with a guidance counselor as an academic advisor to talk about the career center and what careers we're going to do. And I went in to see I played football and track in college, so my focus was always athletics. And the counselor said, look, what do you want to do? I need to know what you want to do, your skills, and then we can help you get a job. And I said, I don't know. He said, well, come back in a week. So I sat down and I thought, what do I want to do? And I said, I want to travel around the world on cruise ships. I love the Love Boat. Remember that? I want to be Gopher or something. I want to travel around the world on cruise ships. I want to get paid to go to museums and battlefields and move the cannons around and make them do it right. I want to write books. I want to tell people stories about history and politics. I want to have rallies against the war in Iraq, or if I want to march for Me Too, I want to march with Black Lives Matter, I want to march with, March for Our Lives, I want to have rallies against Trump, I want to, back then I was Reagan, I wanted to march against Reagan. I'm like, how am I going to get a job to do all this? So I thought, well, that's what I really want to do. So I remember I went back to see my advisor, and I told him, this is what I'm going to do for a living. I'm going to write books, lecture on cruise ships, travel around the world, give history tours, and tell battlefields where to put the cannons, and I'm going to have anti-Reagan rallies. And he said, he dropped a curse word. He said, you're bleeping nuts. And, you know, I've always thought about writing him and saying, guess what I do now? So, here we are. All right, so why do some stories about writing history books. First off, historians are prophets in reverse. We think the past is known, but it's the future that's unknown. I would argue that the past is almost equally as unknown. Daniel Borston, the late great librarian of Congress, had a rule of the unread. Basically, Borston said that 99% of every book ever written is lost. It's burned, destroyed on purpose, decomposed, right? Now think about it. A piece of paper today is, chemically treated, it's, refined paper, it's processed. If you take that piece of paper and you put it out here in the grass and come back this summer, it'll be soil. Could you imagine parchment 1,000 years ago or a couple hundred years ago? Nothing survived until Ben Franklin came up with his, lightning rod. Everything caught fire and burned eventually. So 99% of books are gone. So for the mathematically inclined, that means we probably have 1% of the historical record to work with, right? So what do we really know about history? The answer is not much. It's sleuthing. It's like being a detective. Only everybody at my crime scene died 200 years ago. So that's exciting. It's exciting work. My sweet spot as an historian, what I like to do is to try to find the stories that history has missed. That's what I work to do. It requires an enormous amount of time. Almost every other weekend of my life, I go to an archive, a battlefield, a museum, a presidential library, something, and I do work. Now, fortunately, I would be broke because of all these trips, but what I do is I consult and help the docents in the library, so they usually let me either come for free or give me a salary. And unfortunately, Lynn has given me these wonderful distinguished and eminent titles, so I have a budget. So I go every other weekend, and it requires a lot of work, but to me, that's not work. That's like my birthday. I'd sit in the basement of the archives and read for 15 hours straight. It requires a lot of work, but man, you uncover the most wonderful stories. So that's my sweet spot. So there's more we don't know about history than we do know. And the key is to get in there and dig. History is not unlike paleontology. And that was one of my possible majors when I was in college. I was close to being a paleontologist, a geologist, an anthropologist. I had like 300 majors I wanted to take. The key for a paleontologist is everybody at their crime scene died 65 to 66 million years ago, right? And the other challenge is all the soft parts of history have disappeared. We don't know what T-Rex sounded like because the tongue and the throat were soft tissue, so it's not there. We don't know what color the brontosaurus was because its skin is decomposed. We don't know what Allosaurus or any of the other ones, Ankylosaurus or Stegosaurus, smelled like. We don't know their hunting habits, their sleeping habits, their mating habits. All the soft tissue's gone. All that we have left are the hard parts. A tooth, a claw, and a footprint in the dried Cretaceous mud. So the key for a paleontologist is to take a footprint, a tooth, and a claw, and reconstruct Stegosaurus's Stegosaurus's eating habits and how it fought against, carnivores. Good luck with that. That's a heck of a challenge. But it's the same for historians. Because a lot of our soft stuff, the love letters, the poems, the recipes, the musical scores, the scripts for plays, all this stuff has disappeared. All we have left are the hard parts, just like a paleontologist. We have what? The castles, the cannons, and the crowns. This is why, like me, you hated your history classes. Because it was just rote memorization of one castle, one king, and one war after. Because historians cherry-picked the castles, the cannons, and the crowns. My argument was always, well, what happened in 100 years between the war? What did the king eat? How did the people live? How did they raise their kids? You know, who were the good guys? Who were the bad guys? That's the soft parts of history. So that's what I like to do. And I think it's enormously fulfilling. It's enormously challenging. And the beauty of it is, after 31 years, I'm not beginning to scratch the surface of the tip of the iceberg. And today, we all have the pleasure of living through what is the golden age of history. David McCullough, oh, by the way, his health is really bad right now. People are worried. It doesn't look good. Ron Chernow, Doris Kearns Goodwin, John Meekum, Gordon Wood, Harold Holzer, Joseph Ellis. We are living through a period of the greatest historians ever are all working right now in this country. So we are blessed. We are absolutely blessed. But yet, collectively, all these folks aren't even scratching the surface. So that means there's always material out there, right? So one of the challenges is to go through letters. Friends of mine know that if you ever need the oil in your car changed, I have no idea how to do it. Friends and people that know me tease me, I can't fix the laundry machine. I can barely put a light bulb in. But if you have a really old family letter, I'm so your guy. I know my old letters. So you go through old letters, and that's how we reconstruct history. And what we do is we have it's the architecture of history is what I call it. Think of a skeleton. But each letter and poem and recipe puts meat and sinew and tendons and blood on that skeleton. It breathes life into the human narrative. So we really have to spend a lot of time with letters and poems and songs and recipes and to reconstruct history. The problem is the letters don't always tell us everything. Think about the fact that we don't have women's letters. The vast majority of women who have ever lived were illiterate. Therefore, it rendered them voiceless or invisible to us today. Women did not have enfranchisement, fundamental rights in this country until the year 1920, right? Women that were living on the frontier, could you imagine trying to prepare meals, raise a family, when you had to go down to the river and, scrub clothes and gut a deer that your husband might shoot once every 3 months, and no disposable diapers, no Publix, no drive-through Taco Bell, no Ziploc out baggies, no freezer. How did they live? So in other words, what woman had the time to write? Not only did they not have the time to write, they couldn't write, and where do you get the pen and the papers? The parchment. Yeah, you can't order it on Amazon if you're out in the frontier. A stagecoach may or may not come through every 4 months, right? Now, if you do have time to write, if you are illiterate, if you manage to write it down, how do you preserve it? You're in a sod house that leaks whenever it rains, there's bugs, it's humid, there's no air conditioning, it rots after a couple of years. If you do preserve it, what man is going to see fit to publish it? The answer is none. I mean, we really didn't systematically study women's history until the most recent generation, right, everybody? I'm a very youthful 60 as of last weekend, and I never had a women's history class. I've been teaching it for about 27 of my 31 years because nobody else wanted to teach it, nobody else learned, so I said, I'll prep it, I'll do it. Likewise, substitute for women, African Americans, substitute American Indians, substitute immigrants, substitute refugees, substitute Latinos, substitute the disabled, substitute Jews, pick it. We just don't have those words. They were not valued, therefore they were not preserved. So I actually teach all those topics on campus, and I never had a single class in any of them. But nobody else did, and I was the one willing to prep. So, in that respect, let's say I'm 28 and I'm getting my PhD at Princeton in history. And let's say I approach my dissertation committee and I say, man, I have a heck of an idea. It's a topic everybody's missed. It's going to provide valuable insights into the day-to-day lives of people. It's going to make a profound contribution to the knowledge base. My entire committee at Princeton is sitting on the edge of their seats. I said, nobody's done it. You ready? I'm going to write about recipes in the 1800s. I'm going to write about child rearing during the Revolution. And they're all going to go, what? Write about World War II, right? So nobody's going to preserve it because men weren't going to preserve women's history or such topics. So, in other words, there's still a lot of mines that are left untapped, so there's a lot out there. So letters. So we go through and we look at the letters. Some of you know, and I always use this as an example. Those of you that know me know I've never liked Thomas Jefferson. In fact, I dislike him more with every passing year, or like him less, I guess I should say, with every passing year. Jefferson was brilliant, there's no doubt about it. He was a hypocrite, but he was brilliant. He was also thin-skinned who blamed everybody else for his own mistakes. Hamilton was a pain in the ass, but Hamilton owned it. John Adams couldn't tell a lie. Jefferson lived in lies. But at any rate, so Jefferson wrote beautifully, no doubt. He was a poet, right? Read the Declaration. It's high prose or poetry. So Jefferson left us this treasure trove of thousands of letters, and they're detailed and beautifully written. So, here's the problem though. Jefferson had the first copy machine in the country. You've seen it at Monticello. It's a draftsman's table at a 45-degree angle. He would tack down 2 pieces of paper, and he had his quill, and it was connected to a pulley. So whenever he wrote with one thing, it wrote so he'd mail one letter and keep the other one. So he kept a record. Now, he did this for the obvious, records keeping. You mail a letter and you have proof of what you said. But he also did it because he did not trust the person he was mailing it to preserve his genius. Yeah, he was a megalomaniac. They all were, except Truman and Grant, but they all were. So he wanted to save his own work so that we would read it one day. Now, the fact that he was cognizant of what the future would think about him means that Jefferson often fibbed in the letters. He put himself in a favorable light in his letters and would stick it in the file. He also changed the date on the letters. So Jefferson was president, our third president, from 1801 to 1809. Madison was the Secretary of State. So let's say Madison does something good and we get a good treaty and it promotes peace in the year 1807. Jefferson would sit down and write, I think, in a year or two we should have Madison pursue this because I think it's going to work out. And he would predate it like 2 years earlier. He knew the outcome. So we read it today and we go, oh my goodness. Jefferson even knew the lottery numbers. He knew what the weather was going to be like next year. This guy was brilliant. So the problem is when you get Jefferson's letters, you don't know what to believe. So when I work on Jefferson, I contact the top Jefferson people. Joe Ellis at Mount Holyoke, 2-time Pulitzer Prize winner. And I say, those of you that come to my events, we had him at the Society of the Four Arts and a couple other programs. I'd say, Joe, I got this letter. Is it the real Jefferson or is it the 2.0? And he goes, I don't know. What do you think? I go, I don't know. So the answer is we don't know. George Washington, I'm a big George fan. One of my recent books is all about Washington. And unlike Jefferson, I really like Washington. And I like him more every year. Problem is Washington was a phonetic speller, which means he'd spell phonetic with an F. Right? Washington was also poorly traveled, poorly educated, and poorly read. He made one trip out of the country to Barbados, right? So he was there on one of my cruises, I think. So he was there as a teenager, spent a few days in Barbados and contracted something. We know that he liked to go out all night and dance with the local ladies. So I put 1 and 1 together and wrote in one book that he enjoyed the tropical fruits of Barbados. And who can blame him? So Washington's poorly read, poorly traveled, poorly educated, phonetic speller, and he had a volcanic temper. So you can imagine how horrendous his letters were. Once he wins the Revolutionary War, he realizes, as King George III, his enemy, said, Washington's the greatest man alive. And he's thinking, oh my goodness, all those letters? It's as if they would have had Facebook and all that when you and I were teenagers. Could you imagine what we would have left behind and the dumb photos? Right, Jack? We would have taken some dumb photos. So Washington realizes he needs to clean up his letters. So he gets Tobias Lear, who's a Harvard-educated aide, to go around all of his neighbors' homes to go find the Continental Congress to to go visit all of his officers and say George wants his letters back. He collects piles of letters, takes them back to Mount Vernon, and with the help of Lear, who's brilliant, and Hamilton, who's brilliant, they rewrite his letters and redeliver them. So we don't know which ones are the real ones and which ones are 2.0. My rule that I use, if the letter's really well done, I assume it's the second one, and it was probably written by Hamilton or Lear. You know, but that's my guess, right? If it's poorly written, it's probably George. But who knows? Here's the other problem. Washington died on December 14, 1799, and left behind probably 1,000+ letters. His wife Martha dies 2.5 years later in May of 1802, and most of the letters are gone. Put one and one together, we believe Martha burned them, which was very common at the time. Jefferson burned, his wife died, Martha Wales Skelton. Jefferson died about 19 years before his presidency. He burned all their letters, the lockets, the portraits. He removed her from history out of grief. So Martha was private, so we think she torched most of George's letters. Probably a cold night in Mount Vernon with her signature Betty Crocker, Mrs. Santa Claus bonnet, sitting in front of the fireplace after making matzo ball soup for her grandkids. Right? You know, and she's probably looking at the letters and she's reading them and missing George and she's throwing them in the fire. That's our guess. We don't know. So when you look at George's letters, we don't know if it's the real letter or the one that Martha decided should be saved. So I imagine Martha reading one of George's letters, and George always had a thing for his wealthy, hot neighbor, Sally Carey Fairfax, who was the bomb, okay? And she was smitten with George. She was George's muse. She's the one who taught him social discourse, how to dance, you know, etiquette, and introduced him to the people he would need to meet in order to become the George of history. So I'm sure there's a letter, there's a handful of letters left which are unmistakable in tone between George and Sally. I mean, if I smoked, I would have had to have had a cigarette. I even put some cologne behind my ears when I read the letters. So I'm sure there was a letter Martha found in the file that said, my gosh, my neighbor Sally, when she's out gardening, woo, right? And I'm sure Martha went, that one goes in the fire. And in the next letter, George said, you know, Martha's my worthy partner. She's an anchor in the stormy sea of the founding of this nation, and I rely on her. And she's like, ooh, that stays in the, keeping that one. So how do we really get it? We get a glimpse of the George Martha wanted us to get a glimpse of. You get the point? So I don't even know that we can rely on the letters. I don't know that we can rely on the paintings either. Think about it. Only the wealthiest of the wealthy got their image painted. 99% of the people never got their images painted, so we don't know who they are. If you're an artist back then, you're not celebrated like someone in New York City today. You don't have your exhibit in the Louvre. You know what you do? You're starving. And most of them travel from town to town. And when you go into the town, the wealthy people would hire you and you paint them or their kids. And if you did a good job, you got a referral to the next town. So they're going to paint an overly complimentary version, aren't they? Because they want to eat dinner. And if you really do a good job painting the kids, the wife is like, oh, I want you to paint me. And you paint her to look like Beyonce, and she's like, oh, that's a good likeness. Could you paint 2 more? Right? And the king's probably like, give me some abs. You know? Right? It's like King Clooney, right? So how accurate are the paintings? We don't know. I did a fun project years ago where I took all the known paintings of George Washington. And I looked at him relevant to the horses, the cannons, the battlefield, and extrapolated. George was almost 10 feet tall. He towers over horses, battlefields, cannons, because you got to paint him gigantic, because he's George. Think about it. The ancient Romans had Romulus, right? The ancient Greeks had the Olympians. You know, the ancient English had Arthur. They were all myths. We had George, who was real. So we got to impose godlike qualities on him, right? So it's hard to get a sense of a normal George, right? And that is our challenge. So don't y'all love that? I love that. So there we go. So I'll give you a handful of examples. One of my books is about the First Ladies. It's called The President's Wives, and a new version was released, I don't know, 2014-ish. It was fun because it gave me an excuse to call the First Ladies and do interviews with them. And I did the first edition like 25 years ago, so I got the call a lot. So I was calling and calling and calling and not having any progress, trying to set up interviews with Betty Ford and Ross Carter and everybody, Barbara Bush and so on. But I called Lady Bird Johnson, and I always liked Lady Bird, by the way, and Claudia was her name. And I called Lady Bird Johnson's aide, and I told her who I was, and I wanted to write a book about the First Ladies that didn't focus on dresses and lipstick. It was the contributions behind the scenes, the fingerprints on history, which is, you know, my sweet spot, right? What have we missed? And I loved Eleanor, of course. Everybody loves Eleanor. Eleanor's my favorite First Lady, no question. But my argument was that Eleanor may not have been such an anomaly. I bet a lot of these women were quite something. But we just never gave them credit for it, so I wanted to try to uncover this. And to my horror, the aide goes, okay, I'll get Mrs. Johnson. And I'm like, oh! And she comes on the phone. And I said, I'd like to set up an interview. She said, sure. And Lady Bird Johnson was gracious and wonderful. She told me something cool. You know, she was known for the beautification program. She removed unsightly billboards, wildflowers, native, don't you love the native wildflowers along the road when you drive around the country in the spring and summer? Yeah. She did urban greenery, which is now hot. She was decades ahead of her time. Great program. She hated the name beautification. She wanted it called conservation because she was preserving natural spaces, and not just natural spaces, but natural vistas and views. I mean, could you imagine driving around Hawaii and seeing a McDonald's billboard, right? I hate billboards. So she said, but the problem was in the 60s, they thought conservation was too masculine. They needed to put a feminine, safe pink, so beautification. She hated it. So it gives you a sense of how far we've come. Now, the cool thing about Lady Bird was after I interviewed her, I called all the other First Ladies' offices. And I said, I just talked to Lady Bird. And they all went, hang on, I'll get Mrs. Bush. Hang on, I'll get Mrs. Ford. Everybody agreed to an interview except Mrs. Reagan, who apparently doesn't interview with anybody. And apparently no one liked her, and apparently she liked no one, according to everybody, including the other First Ladies. All the rest of them got along like peanut butter and jelly, by the way. So that was fun to get some insights. Betty Ford shared with me a really great quote, two of them. One, she said, quote unquote, being ladylike does not require silence. Right? I like that. I've always been a big Betty fan, by the way. You know, when she talked openly about breast cancer, first time the word breast was mentioned on primetime television, and Republicans and preachers around the country censored her, went after her, you know, about how dare she. So I did a project at the Ford Library in Michigan, almost 30 years ago. I went through the letters that came in to Mrs. Ford after that interview, and oh, they were scathing everybody. It was difficult to read them. You're a disgrace to your husband, to the party. How dare you mention such profanity? Could you imagine if these people saw the Kardashians today? Wow, have we dropped? But what's neat is after a couple of weeks, guess what happened to the letters? And I read more than I could count. The letters started to come in a couple of weeks later. Dear Mrs. Ford, because of your heroic conversational television, my mother went and got screened. She had breast cancer. She's alive today because of you. Yeah. And that just filled the archives. And I thought, you go, Betty Ford. She also spoke openly about addiction, which allowed it to be destigmatized, didn't it, everybody? She also talked openly about kids having sex and using drugs. Do you remember, I believe it was Morley Safer on 60 Minutes, ambushed her and asked her if her daughter Susan was doing drugs or having sex or drinking, what would she think? First off, that's not appropriate for, you know, it's supposed to be an easy interview about the First Lady. You don't ask that. And Mrs. Ford said, you know, these kids these days are doing this. You know, Jerry and I raised the kids not to, but I wouldn't be surprised if they were, because kids do that. And she got lambasted again, just blistered. But you know what? She said, I'd love them just the same. It's the right answer. Maybe not for the mid-70s, But for today, it's the right answer. So I was always a big fan of Betty Ford's. Here's the other quote she gave me that I loved. I asked her if she had any regrets from her first ladyship, and she said, yeah, I wish Jerry had appointed more women to the bench. She said that then, quote unquote, she says to me, you know, I should have lobbied him harder on the pillow. That's like having your grandma talk about the birds and bees. I was like, I didn't know what to say. But I thought that was a great line, great line. So that was a fun book. I think the book I'm maybe most proud of is the Nazi Titanic, which is here in the middle in red, which is just, I still get goosebumps when I think about it. I have resigned myself to the rest of my life. I will never again come up with anything remotely close to this. Some of you have heard the story. So when I became an historian, I made a list of all the books I wanted to write. I wanted to write about Truman, done. World War II, done. Civil War, yep. Lincoln, yep. Revolution, yep. George Washington, yep. First Ladies, yep. War of 1812, yep. But I wanted to write a book on the Holocaust or the end of World War II. And I was thinking about a book on the final week of the war in Europe. Why? Because it was absolute chaos, and we still don't know much about it. The Nazis kept meticulous records, as you all know. I mean, it's remarkable how much they wrote down. I mean, you know the temperature and what the senior leadership around Hitler ate every day. I mean, they wrote everything down. But not the last week of the war in Europe. They were too busy dying, committing suicide, or running for their lives, or getting captured, thank God. The British also kept pretty good records, but not the last week of the war in Europe, because they were too busy trying to race to Berlin. So that last week is chaos. Plus, in the last week of the war, Berlin, one of the world's truly great cities, was reduced to rubble, including the propaganda office, the Nazi party office, which means all the letters, records, it was all destroyed. So that last week of the war was kind of a question mark. So what I wanted to do was try to do an investigation of what it was like to be there in that last week of the war. I thought that would be cool. So I was starting on April 30th, which is the day Hitler committed suicide, took a cyanide pill, shot himself in the head, had the body burned in a breach carton, the trifecta, the hat trick. And then a week later, May 8th-ish, VE Day. So what I thought I'd do is I was going to make each day a chapter and tell one story of love and one story of loss. I thought that would be touching. It's too big of a topic to say, here's my book on the last week of the war. Oh my God, the world's worst war. 60 to 80 million dead around the world. So I thought I would just take it down to the individual level, right? A couple survived the concentration camps. That's a chapter. A baby was born. A soldier was killed by mistake, right? Some Nazi commandant committed one last barbarous act of inhumanity. Another one committed an act of surprising humanity. I thought that would be the book. So I'm looking for extraordinary stories and letters, so I'm just living in the archives. And I find a letter from a British major named Noel Till, T-I-L-L. And he writes that at the end of the war, he was on the Baltic coast, southern Baltic, northern Germany, near a place called Lübeck Bay. And he wrote that of all the horrors of the war, he'd never seen anything quite like what he watched when thousands and thousands of concentration camp survivors and POWs all died gruesomely at the end of the war. And I read that and I'm like, wow, I don't remember that. So I called the World War II Museum in New Orleans. I called the Holocaust Museum in Washington. And I said, what was this event? And they all said it didn't happen. There was no event. I said, I didn't think so, but what is he talking about? It didn't happen. So I said, okay. So I set the letter aside, but he kept, it's like, Robert, he kept calling me, right? Because like I said, I know old letters, and it seemed legitimate. I go back and I dig around, and by dumb luck, which is always how discovery works, right? You're looking for a cure for this, and you find a cure for that. You're looking for this island, and you bump into a new continent, or whatever. So I'm digging around looking for letters again, and I find a letter from a general. He's a British general named Mills Roberts, and he's a general of the 6th Commando. That's a special forces unit, like our 82nd Airborne or something. They're, badasses. And General Mills Roberts, who spent a lifetime in combat and uniform, he writes that he's never seen anything quite so shocking and disturbing as when he stood on the Baltic coast and watched thousands die miserably at the end of the war. And I'm like, that's a pretty good, reliable source. This lifelong, I never liked Patton, by the way, but he's a badass like Patton. So, although he wasn't an anti-Semite, a pain in the butt. I get that letter and I go, oh my gosh, right? So I called Yad Vashem, I called the Holocaust Museum, I called the World War II Museum, I called the Imperial War Museum in London, one of my favorites. And I said, what's this event? Everybody said it never happened. And I said, I didn't think so, but I got 2 letters. And there's no record of it. So I called historians, I called rabbis, I was calling everybody. So I decided I'm going to solve the mystery myself. So if you have, anybody have a family member who's in World War II? Yeah, okay. You can contact the Pentagon or various sources and they will find your uncle or whatever this relative, they'll find his unit and all the battles he was in, right? And you can follow them through the war. So I decided to do that. So I got Till's unit and I followed it the whole way through the war. I knew what all the battles they were in, what he did, yada, yada, yada. And when I got to the end of the war, the record disappeared. I thought, oh. So I went to Mills Roberts, and guess what? Same thing. So I thought, okay, either they were abducted by aliens, but I don't deal with that stuff, right? We leave that to Fox. Or the records are all classified. So I thought, okay, so long story short, did my homework. I had some guesses of what happened, and I figured they would be in the Royal Archives in London, because that's where most of the end of the war stuff went when it was brought back to loaded up and then taken to Southampton, put in a lorry, driven to London, and put in one of the archives, one there, one in Sussex, one in a couple places. So I call the Royal Archives and I say, hi, my name's Robert Watson. I'm a professor at Lynn University in Boca Raton, and I think you're sitting on one of the biggest stories of the war. There's this, click. All right, let's try it again. Hi, I'm Robert Watson. Don't hang up. I'm not crazy. I think you're sitting, I found these letters, and I think that there is a massive, horrific event, maybe one of the worst of the entire war, maybe one of the worst of the entire Holocaust that happened at the end, that I think it's all classified. Click. Hello, I'm writing letter. I'm doing everything, but I'm putting a message in a bottle. I threw it in the Atlantic. I'm doing semaphore, right? I'm doing smoke signals. I'm trying to get, I can't get anywhere. I'm emailing, I can't get anywhere. And it's driving me nuts. So I'm lecturing for the 70th anniversary of D-Day. And in another 2 years, we'll have the 80th. And if anybody wants to go with me, we're going to go to Paris, go down the River Seine, and go back to Normandy. And I'll walk along the beaches with you and tell you more than you ever wanted to know about Normandy. I mean, we'll dissect everything. So I'm lecturing for the 70th, and I'm just having a blast. And I meet a really, really remarkable woman around my age. Her name's Deborah Oppenheimer. And it turns out she's an Academy. You met her, Janet. A lot of you have met her. Lynn, Claire, Max, Roberta, you met her. So she's a friend. She comes to the university. She's come in countless times. So I meet her at the beach, and she's brilliant. She's attractive. She's fun. She's won the Academy Award. I'm like, wow. She's friends with Samuel L. Jackson. I'm like, does he drop the F-bomb that much? And I love Samuel L. And we're talking, and I'm like, would you mind, can I treat you to dinner tonight in France? I said, do you mind, my wife and my kids are here? She says, no. Do you mind, my parents are here? I'm like, no. So I used to run a weekly series at FAU, if anybody went to that for years. We had like 1,000 people there. I did it every week for, like 15 years or something crazy. So she comes walking in with her parents, and here comes Eric and Gloria Oppenheimer. And they used to sit in the front row of my weekly series for years. I'm like, Eric and Gloria, what are you doing here? They said, we're here for your tour. I'm like, that is really cool. And then we were going on a cruise. I'm like, that is fantastic. And I go, wait a minute, Deborah, this is your daughter? I'm like, what kind of Jewish mother are you that you didn't tell me your daughter won the Academy Award, right? I mean, if my kid wins, Roberta, I'd have it on a t-shirt. In fact, all of you would get a free t-shirt, right? And a copy of the movie. And Debbie looks at me and she goes, you're that guy they go to listen to all the time? I'm like, So she says, tell me about your books. My parents love your books. And I said, I want to hear about Samuel L. It turns out she did the movie Into the Arms of Strangers about the Kindertransport. Anybody? 2001 Academy Award. And I'm like, oh my God, love the movie. I showed it to my students on campus. I've shown it probably half a dozen times. I have it at home. I love your movie. So we were super excited. So she said, tell me about your books. I'm like, no way. I'm going to tell you about the new book I'm trying to find, which is the story I just told you about, those letters. And I said, honestly, I think one of the biggest stories of the Holocaust and World War II is sitting classified in London. And I don't think anybody knows. She goes, no worries. She goes, I know Prince Charles, Judi Dench, Sir Admiral. I'll make a few phone calls. Guess what? She made phone calls. 2 days later, they call me. They're like, Debbie called. I'm like, all right. She said, you're her bro, you know. What can we do for you? You know, so I resisted telling them to F this and F that. I said, okay, here's what I found. This is what I think it is. And they put their top archivists on it. And 2 days later, they found a box with almost 800 pages of top secret classified documents, buried away for 70 years. On the side of the box, it said, classified, not to be opened until the year 2045, making it a 100-year secret. Wow, I was right. So long story, well, I was going to say short, but I've already been here 4 hours, I think. So I'll finish up on Sunday, okay? So just get like takeout pizza or something. What was in the box was the story of the Nazi Titanic, which is my book. Long story short, I promise this one, the Germans had a replica of the Titanic. You can see her there on the cover. And at the end, Hitler loved the ship. He called it the Nazi Titanic. They used it for propaganda purposes. Joseph Goebbels made movies about it. And at the end of the war, after Hitler died, the Nazis did not want the Allies to get their ship. So they docked it off the coast of Lübeck Bay, that's port of Neustadt, N-E-U, New City. And they filled it up with thousands of POWs and thousands of concentration camp survivors. They had thousands more at the port, thousands in train cars, thousands ready to, and they're going to fill it up. And the plan is they're going to blow it up at the end of the war. An FU to the world. They will deny the world from getting Hitler's beloved Nazi Titanic. More people will die on this ship than will die in the Titanic, which means the world will forget about the Titanic. That's the plan. And in the final hours of the war, the British, by mistake, blew up the ship, thinking the Germans were loading on it to escape. When the British Typhoon Mark 1B bombers flew into Lübeck Bay, they saw the biggest ship anybody had ever seen low in the water, which meant it was full of people and full of fuel. It was full of people and full of fuel so the Nazis could blow it up. They thought the Germans were trying to escape. They killed thousands at the port, thousands on the ship, and it turns out to be the bloodiest hour, you know, maybe in world history, other than dropping of the atomic bomb. Turns out to be the bloodiest hour of the Holocaust, the world's worst maritime tragedy. So what a story, right? Another book of mine is called The Ghost Ship of Brooklyn. So I wanted to write a book on the Revolutionary War, but I wanted to do something different, because that's what I like to do. So I knew that the British took prisoners of war, as we did, as everybody did. And I heard that the British had this ship that they turned into a prison ship that was just a charnel house of blood and guts. So I thought that would make a hell of a book. Here's the short part. You ready for this? More people died on this one prison ship than died in combat during the entirety of the war. You ready for this number to get better? Twice as many Americans died on the one ship that died in combat during the entirety of the war, 1775 to 1783. So I heard about, I didn't know those numbers, but I heard that it was bad. So I was talking to historians around the country. How come nobody's written about this? How do I get letters on it? Where are the archives? How do I get started on this thing? And almost every historian went, never heard of it. Only one historian knew all about it, the great Gordon Wood. Some of you have met Gordon. Gordon is an eminent, distinguished, retired professor from Brown. He's considered the nation's top, without question, revolutionary scholar. Basically, you know, you read Gordon Wood, then you talk about the revolution. You know, read Gordon, then we'll talk. So Gordon knew all about it, which didn't surprise me. But I said to him, so tell me, how do I go about this? And he said, I don't think there's enough left for you to write a book. I think it'd make a great book, but I don't know. So I'm like, okay. So I found out, I assumed a lot of the men that died at sea were privateers. A privateer is a government-sanctioned pirate. We didn't have much of a navy, and the British were the masters of the sea, the mistress of the sea, as they said, right? The Royal Navy was the most powerful navy of the time. How can our navy stand up to the Royal Navy? The answer is we couldn't. So what we did is we got all these New England fishermen, merchant ships, and we gave them a letter of marque or a letter of marque and told them you can be a privateer, like a pirate. And therefore, if you sack a British supply ship filled with tons of molasses, you know, whatever else is in it, you can have half of it, or 3/4 of it. The rest go to the government for the war. If you sack a multiple-ton ship full of whatever, you're rich for the rest of your life. And every port was blockaded, and people were dying during the war, which meant every fisherman strapped a cannon onto the fishing boat and went hunting for British merchant ships, supply ships. And it's worth risking your life, because if you catch one of them, you're good to go. Now, the problem is these fishermen need a crew. So what they did is they got 10, 11, 12, 13, 14-year-old boys who were typically the youngest sons who didn't have a future. So you got these illiterate farm boys, and you stick them on the boat, and they're expendable. So many of the people that died in the naval conflicts were these little boys from New England. So what I did is I contacted a half a dozen towns up and down New England on the coast. New Bedford, Providence, New Bedford, etc., up and down the coast. And I contacted librarians at the local libraries. Shout out to librarians. I contacted archives, and I said, listen, and I told them a little bit about the ship, and I said, these young boys from these New England coastal communities would have served as privateers. Many of them were captured, tortured on the ship. Most of them died. Do you have any stories? And to entice them, I really laid out a dramatic version of it. Then I also sent a box of dark chocolate McNuts. You can get people to do dang near anything for dark chocolate McNuts, right, Claire? So, I did that. Months later, I'm researching something else. I get a call from a librarian in Providence, Rhode Island, who's like losing her mind. She goes, oh my God, in the basement of the Providence Library is this 156-page manuscript that's been down here for 200 years. It was written by a 13-year-old boy named Christopher Hawkins, who was a privateer who was put on that ship, and he managed to escape and live to tell the tale. And I went, I'm on my way, with another box of dark chocolate McNuts, okay? So I got Christopher Hawkins' manuscript. And here's the good news. Christopher Hawkins wrote down the name of the other guys that escaped. Their name, the date they escaped, and what town they were from. So there's a guy named Ebenezer Fox, New Bedford, Massachusetts, escaped, let's say, June 1, 1790. So now I can go to the Bedford, Massachusetts newspaper from the first week of June, 1790, and guess what kind of stories I found. We all remember young Ebenezer Fox, who went off to war at 11 and hadn't been heard of since then. A naked skeleton stumbled into town last week. It was Ebenezer, now 13. He had been on the ghost ship and managed to live it. And I'm like, oh my God. So then I got Ebenezer Fox's letters, and he told me about another boy from another town. So armed with the names and dates, I could track them down, right? I ultimately tracked down a dozen that had left diaries, letters about this. Then I eventually found the British records, the American records. Guess who else wrote about it? George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, Ben Franklin. Jefferson, like a lawyer, took depositions. Ben Franklin went to the French and told them what the British were doing to French sailors. George Washington was furious with the British for torturing and slaughtering our men on the ship. Washington would always send letters to Hamilton reminding the British, We have British prisoners. I may resort to the same and just slaughter your men. I'm happy to tell you Washington did not. We should always take the high road as a leader, not the low road. So armed with the story, I was able to tell the story of this ship that is called the Ghost Ship. And twice as many men died on this one ship that died in combat during the war. Extraordinary, right, everybody? The ship goes out to hunt British supply ships. The hunter becomes the hunted. One day, a massive British warship materializes out of the fog and clouds and blows this little fishing boat to smithereens. They fish out Christopher Hawkins and take him to the ghost ship. My book is called The Ghost Ship of Brooklyn. It was anchored 100 yards off the Brooklyn coast, where the Navy Yard was, everybody, looking straight across to Manhattan. So it was anchored right there in that little bay, while about ready. And there they loaded everybody up. And Christopher Hawkins is down to skin and bones and death. He knows he'll never survive. Most men didn't survive. The mortality rate on the ship was almost everybody. So the ship is so rotted that he and a little boy named William Waterman are clawing at the ship every night until they claw a little hole. With that, they get a hole big enough that they strip down, stuck their heads through it, they can worm out and drop down into the water. So they dropped into the water at night. William Waterman went first. Hawkins drops in and never finds William. William was so weak he underestimated it and he drowned. Christopher makes it ashore. He runs by night and hides in barns by day. He's naked, he's starving, he's skeletal. He finally gets caught by the British. He's going to be taken back to the ship. But that night when he's in chains, the door opens up to the barn, and a loyalist who was pissed at the British came in and unlocked him and he escaped again. He can't go any further, so he collapses on the doorstep of a farm. A lady comes out and finds him and looks at him and says, "Were you on the ghost ship?" Turns out her husband just died on the ghost ship. She feeds little Christopher, bathes him, clothes him, and helps him to go home to Rhode Island. He makes it home. He finds out like a brother was dead, the father was missing. He's reunited with his mother. Guess what this young kid does? He re-enlists. You know, unlike the members of Congress that wear a flag on their lapel pin, he was a real patriot. He re-enlisted and fought the rest of the war. Lived through it, wrote his story for the Providence, Rhode Island Library, and it was waiting to be discovered. I'm on the board of the Truman Foundation. All of you know I'm a Harry Truman nut. Several years ago, I was launching a new program for the Truman Library. It's called the History Happy Hour. So I'm happy if you guys want to do that, I'll launch it for you. They got local microbreweries to come and provide free beer, food. Everybody came out and then they get a story and they give a talk about Harry or something. So the director of the library tells me, he says, "Listen, there's this guy, he's a little bit, you know what, every day he calls and says, 'Are you here yet?' He's got to meet you." He said, "I'm worried about you and this guy." I'm like, "I'll meet with him." And when I arrived at my hotel, he's like, "The guy's here the day before waiting for you." I'm like, "Good God, tell him I'll be there tomorrow." So in the morning, the director of the library calls and says he's here waiting for us to open the library. I said, "Well, I'm coming in early to do research before the happy hour at 4 or whatever time." I said, "I'll meet with him in the morning." I walk in and there's a man about 88, he's my height, and he has a little badge on saying Woody Hawkins, the great-great-great-great-grandson of Christopher Hawkins. He bawls and bawls like a baby when he sees me. He has a satchel filled with Christopher Hawkins' letters. He said he spent his whole life like his dad before him, trying to prove that their great-great-grandfather was this great hero. And he cried like a baby and hugged me for like 15 minutes. So I gave him a copy of the book, told him the story. He had heard about my book. Then we worked together with the archivist in the Truman Library to get all these letters in the hands of the National Archives and Christopher's story. George Washington's Final Battle in white, that came out last year. I wanted to write a book about George, but everybody writes a book about George. So next to Delray Beach, Washington, D.C. is my favorite city, right? In the U.S. Okay? Can't compete with Prague or Vienna, but I love D.C. So I wanted to tell the story of Washington, D.C., how it became our capital. And it was all George Washington. So I did a book. George picked the location for the capital, George surveyed the grounds. His first job at age 17 was the surveyor for Culpeper County, Virginia. It was that hot neighbor, Sally Carey Fairfax's husband, Lord Fairfax, that got him the job as surveyor. George hired the architects, he sold the plots of land, he raised money, George did everything but get the tool belt on and build the Capitol. So it was his city and it bears his name. So it's the story of that, which is filled with twists and turns and insanity. The original name for our capital city was Washingtonopolis. Fortunately, they came to their senses and shortened it. There were over 30 cities in contention to be the capital at one point, including Brooklyn. I'm not sure if Cleveland was in the list. Philadelphia was in the list. Sure, not Bryn Mawr, but Philadelphia. So anyways, there were a lot of cities, and everybody was fighting like cats and dogs. We couldn't pick a capital. We went from 1775 until 1800. 25 years, quarter century, without a permanent seat of government. That's no way to start a nation. George was so exasperated. At one point, Ben Franklin came up with a joke. He said, since we can't pick the capital, maybe we should have multiple capitals and we'll just rotate it like a lottery. And he said, because Congress is so unpopular, what we can do is build a Trojan horse, hide Congress in it, wheel it up to the city and hope the city lets them in. They can do the business and we'll get them the hell out before anybody realizes. So George finally says, here's where we're going to build the capital. Which of the 30 cities? None of the above. We're going to hack it out of the bogs, swamps, fields, and forests on the edge of the Potomac and build the greatest city in history. It's going to look like ancient Rome. It'll be inspired by the Athenian experience. It'll be larger than Paris and London. That's audacious. And guess what happened? It happened. So that's the story. Last one I'll end with, it's called Escape over here. How many people like prison escape books and movies? Right? I love them. Escape from Alcatraz, right? Shawshank Redemption, The Count of Monte Cristo. Love this stuff. And as soon as they say the prison is escape-proof, they jinx themselves. Someone's escaping, right? So this book is about the largest prison break in American history that nobody knows about. It occurred in Richmond, Virginia during the Civil War from a wretched Confederate prison called Libby. It was nicknamed Rat Hell, the Bastille of the Confederacy, and the Castle of Despair. You've all heard of Andersonville, which was in Georgia. 13,000 men die in a year there. And many of those that lived through it died right after the war because of the abuse. Southerners died in northern prisons because of disease. Northerners died in southern prisons because of disease, torture, murder, abuse. It's a really sad commentary on Southern culture that they just went all out to torture and slaughter Northern prisoners. In Libby, they had what they called the Libby Lottery. Libby was fascinating because, one, it's in Richmond. That's the capital of the Confederacy, right? The first capital was Montgomery in Alabama, but it was too far from anything. Richmond had multiple roads, multiple railways, and the James River intersecting it. So it's perfect for trade. And so it was a good capital. I love Richmond, by the way. Love the city. So they had a Libby Lottery. So it was important because it was in Richmond. It was important because it was right on Tobacco Row. It backed up to the James River. Near Tredegar Iron Works, if anybody knows Richmond today. Well, I'll tell you that in a minute because there's a great ending to the story. It's also important because it was for colonels and generals, high-ranking officers. So some of the top officers of the war were there. What the South would do is they'd play a lottery. They'd get like 8 colonels, tell you to pull straws. They'd read your names. Whomever got the short straw, they just killed you. So you never know when your name was going to be pulled. They put explosives around the prison and threatened to blow it up all day. They used the prison as a human zoo. They gave tours. There would be a Union general at 80 pounds naked in his own feces lying there, and the Southerners would walk in and go, ah, throw garbage on him. They'd say, we must be winning the war, because look, all the generals are. So it was propaganda, a zoo, inhuman, just terrific. It was again, a charnel house. So the men were dying en masse there. The problem for the Confederacy is they captured a big badass colonel named Thomas E. Rose from Philadelphia. Rose was a big, burly, Harley-Davidson-looking guy who had the personality of a chipmunk. He was a big, tough guy, but was nice and humble. Philadelphia, he's influenced by the Quakers. He's an abolitionist. So he joins the war to fight against slavery and injustice. He rises from private to colonel like that. He's one of these officers like a Teddy Roosevelt Jr. or TR that leads from the front. Pulls the sword, he's the first one into the enemy. I mean, the men loved it about him, this bear of a man. He's captured at the Battle of Chickamauga, and he's taken by train to Richmond. The problem is when you go to Richmond, everybody knew they were going to Libby, the castle of despair. And there's only one way out, horizontal in a box. So the Union soldiers were scared to death. Plus they had to walk the Richmond Gauntlet. You walk from the train station to the prison, and all the local residents and Southerners would line up on either side of the road. And as the prisoners were coming down, they spit on them, threw shit on them, threw garbage on them, came up and hit them with wood, sucker punched them. So the prisoners are all lumped together, scared to death as they're getting abused, as they're marched through to death. When they arrived at the prison, they looked in the windows of the bars, and skeletal faces of despair looked out at them. And the commandant would say, "Look there, that's your future." And so they were scared to death. And very front, as they're marching down the street, is Rose, Colonel Rose. Now, he tried to jump off the train and escape and broke his foot and ankle. Yet he's walking on it. And people are coming up, spitting on him, hitting him. Rose doesn't flinch, doesn't even wipe the spit and feces off of himself. The men think he's lost his mind because they're all cowering. He's just walking out front. The reason why he was just walking is he was counting the number of steps. He was memorizing every street, every Confederate picket, everywhere there was a lantern. He was planning his escape. He's beaten, stripped, robbed, and thrown into and every day he's planning his escape. The escape is surreal. It's a movie. So if you know Steven Spielberg, tell him I got his next movie. Plus I have to pay tuition for my daughter. He digs a tunnel better than the Great Escape from the Stalag during World War II. And it's the largest prison break in American history. And Rose defies every possible odd and gets out 109 men. It's a harrowing escape. Twists and turns, the biggest manhunt in American history until the hunt for Booth a year later. February 9th, 1864 was the escape. The men, many of them make it. After all that, when they're in sight of Williamsburg, which is 60 miles southeast of Richmond, which the Union took, as Rose is ready to make it to Williamsburg, he's recaptured. 5 guards jump in. He beats the hell out of most of them, but then they hit him over the head but knock him out. He's taken back to Richmond and beaten, stripped, robbed again, and put in solitary. Somehow, he lived through it. And at the end of the week, he went back in uniform. Spent a long life in uniform, rose to the rank of general. The men whose lives he saved begged him to write an account of all this. He was too humble to brag about it. He said, "I was just lucky." They're like, "You saved all of us. You defied, no." But because he was so humble, it prompted the other men to write his story. And I found 10 versions of it. Then I found the Confederate records, I found the Union records, I found the newspapers of it. I found more than I could use. So today, unfortunately, at the end of the war, they tore down Libby, shipped it to Chicago, and made it into a museum, but the museum went out of business and they gave everything away. So there's a brick in Ohio, there's a barred window in Richmond, there's a key somewhere, but the prison's gone. So this remarkable place in Richmond that was the site of some of the most heinous crimes against humanity in American history is gone and forgotten. So if you go to the site today, as I have, straight along the James River, there's now a flood wall with a hole right where the prison sat. And people will go through there to go jogging and walk their dogs. So everybody pees on the edge of it, And I've gone there many times and asked everybody, anybody know what was here? Nobody had an idea. There's a little license plate on the wall that says this is where Libby Prison, the site of all this death and destruction. And bodies to the tune of we don't know how many underfoot. Here's what's cool. On the other side of the road, 20th Street, is the Virginia Holocaust Museum. They built a Holocaust museum on the site of all this death and hopelessness and mayhem. And guess what? They had no idea what they were building on. So I met with the senior leadership of the Holocaust Museum and said, do you know what's underneath this place? No one had any idea. So what a poetic twist. So I guess there's way more stories out there waiting to be found. I just finished one book and I've got 2 others in progress right now, one writing and one research. Can't wait to get those out and start another 3. So with that, thank you for coming. Thank you.